Great Responsibility. Chapter 28. Dreams. Piper kinda wished she hadn't told them yet. Sam was still freaking out even as she got them their ice cream. She told them it was a secret and that very few people were privy to the knowledge, but Sam couldn't seem to contain himself. It was kind of amusing, though.
So, wait, you know the Avengers?
Piper handed him his mint chocolate chip cone, a sardonic look on her face. Sam, I live with them. They're obnoxiously awesome. He didn't stop, though.
Can you access the armors?
Piper licked her triple chocolate chunk cone. Some of them. Sam, can we maybe talk about this later in a less public capacity? Sam was about to speak again when Danny slapped a hand over his mouth.
That sounds lovely, Piper. Thank you for the ice cream.
MJ laughed. I had the same kind of questions when he took her in. Piper slung an arm around MJ's shoulders. MJ has been there for me since the beginning. There was a honk from the parking lot, and Piper looked up to see the sleek black Audi Happy normally drove. He dropped them off at an ice cream parlor on 6th Avenue. Piper glanced at MJ. She nodded. Piper raced over to the car. Happy, what's wrong? He frowned.
It's your dad. He got hurt. They're back at the tower. Get in the car.
Piper dropped her ice cream cone and hopped into the back seat, and the car sped off. Sam was about to complain about her leaving them behind when MJ switched on the news on her phone. In Avengers news today, a skirmish with AIM scientists turned sour when entrepreneur Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man, took a shot to the chest during the battle. At our last update, the millionaire is in critical condition in the medical wing of Avengers Tower. All press has been denied access. MJ switched off the newscast. Ava swore.
I hope he's going to be okay.
MJ nodded at Ava. Me too. She can't lose anyone else. I don't think she'd be able to handle it. Piper ran to the elevator and demanded to be taken to the medical floor. Jarvis obliged. Pepper met her at the door.
Come with me, sweetie. He's asleep, but he should be fine.
Piper breathed properly for the first time since she'd dropped her ice cream in the parking lot. Pepper rushed her into one of the recovery suites. Tony was asleep. On the bed, he had bandages on his chest and scratches on his face. Steve was sitting next to the bed looking guilty. He looked up and stood as Piper entered the room. He rushed over to her and hugged her.
I'm sorry, Piper.
She shook her head. Don't be sorry, Uncle Steve. You brought him home. That's what's important. Not who shot him, or if he took the bullet for someone. You got him home. Thank you. Steve nodded, tears in his eyes, as Piper took over his chair, wrapping her hand in her father's. Pepper and Steve left the two of them alone. Piper flopped her head down onto the bed next to her father's hand and cried. It had been a long day. She was emotionally exhausted and still healing from the fight with Taskmaster. She found herself drifting on the edge of sleep. Soon she took the tumble over the edge. She was in a house, hiding behind a curtain. Someone was counting. A man. She could tell by his voice. It sounded so familiar. He reached 10 and spoke again.
Ready or not, here I come.
She giggled as overly loud steps crossed the living room. Soon the curtain was pulled aside and she was swept off her feet, giggling the whole way. He was tall, taller than Tony, but not quite the same height as Uncle Steve. His hair was wiry and brown, but he didn't have a beard. He had a set of thick-rimmed glasses perched on his nose and the same big blue eyes Piper saw in the mirror. She threw her tiny arms around his neck. Daddy! He smiled wide and ruffled her long brown hair.
Found you, sweetie.
He looked like he was going to say something else when a cry and loud booming noise sounded from upstairs. Richard, get up here! Bring Piper with you! He ran up the stairs, pausing at one of the always locked end tables. He placed a thumb over the keyhole and it flashed with light for a moment before the drawer opened, revealing a stash of guns and a few knives. He resettled her on his hip and shushed her as she was about to ask a question. He opened the door, careful to keep Piper out of the line of sight of the door. He held the gun in his other hand and sighed with relief when all he found on the other side of the door was a woman. She was also tall, around 5'7", with the same long brown hair Piper had. Her eyes were brown, though, and Piper reached out for her. "Mom!" She took Piper from her father and hugged her. Only then did Piper see the disaster that the study had turned into. Piper frowned. Her father spoke.
"What happened in here?"
Piper shook her head. "Wasn't me." Her mother nodded, running a hand through her hair. "I know it wasn't you, sweetie. Someone was looking for something, Richard." Her father paled.
"Did they find it?"
Her mother shook her head. "I don't think so." She handed Piper back to her father and quick-stepped over to one of the walls. Piper frowned as her mother pushed aside one of the pictures on the wall and placed her hand on the panel behind it. The wall shuddered and opened, revealing a small, nearly closet-sized space off the study that Piper had never seen before. There were guns on one of the walls and a small desk with a metal briefcase on top of it. On the briefcase was printed an insignia, a circle with what looked like a bird in it. Piper hadn't seen it before. They didn't get it, but they knew to look here.
"Mary, we need to up our timetable. I'll call the director, set up a rendezvous. And the Brocks will need their testimony."
Mary nodded and took Piper from her father's arms, again before stepping out of the room. "Sweetie, I need you to do something for me, okay?" Piper nodded and her mother smiled. "I need you to go pack a backpack, okay? Some clothes and your blankie. You're gonna go stay with your Aunt May and Uncle Ben for a bit, okay?" Piper shook her head. "Mommy, I don't want you to go." Mary hugged her daughter tight. "We'll be back, sweetie, I promise. Now go pack a bag." Piper ran off to her room and packed her bag. Soon they were in the car. Piper dozed in the back seat and woke to her father shaking her shoulder.
"We're here, sweetie."
He picked her up and carried her and her backpack inside. Her mother was already inside talking to her Aunt May. "She likes chocolate milk. She won't drink normal milk. We should be back in a couple of weeks. I'm so sorry for the short notice." Aunt May hugged her mom.
"It's okay, Mary."
Her Uncle Ben took her from her father's arms as she rubbed her eyes. Uncle Ben hugged her father with one arm.
"I wish you could tell us where we're going, Richard."
Her father shook his head.
"You know I can't, Ben. It's safer if you don't know."
He handed her backpack to her uncle, then pulled something out of his pocket and pressed it into her uncle's hand.
"If anything happens to us, show this to Piper when she's old enough to understand."
He pressed a small silver USB drive with the same symbol on it as the briefcase into her uncle's hand, then hugged Piper one more time. Her mother rushed over to them and hugged her daughter one last time. She kissed her on the forehead and hugged her again before they rushed out of the door and back into the car. Her uncle held her close as she drifted back to sleep in his arms. Piper woke up to someone running their hand through her hair. Despite the tears streaming steadily down her face, she looked up into the tired face of Tony Stark and threw herself into his arms. He laughed and groaned in pain. She pulled back. "Sorry." He shook his head.
"No need to be sorry. Why are you crying, Pipes? I'm gonna be okay."
She nodded and wiped at her face. "I know. I had a dream about when Mom and Dad left." Tony wrapped his arms around his daughter and let her cry. Chapter 29, A Step Back. Over the next few weeks, while Tony was in recovery, Piper went through life on autopilot. She fought with the team against baddies as Spider-Girl and tried to be herself, but she couldn't get the dream that she'd had out of her head. It had been so vivid, so real. Luke sat down next to her during one of the breaks between rounds of Save the Citizen.
"The others told me your story."
Piper nodded, not looking up from her sketch she was working on.
"If you ever want someone to talk to, I got you. I know how it feels to be alone."
Piper looked up and smiled. Her mask was sitting beside her. "Thanks, Luke. I appreciate it." Luke looked over her shoulder.
"What's that you're drawing?"
Piper glanced down at her paper and frowned. "I had a dream a few weeks ago about the night my parents left, the last time I ever saw them. Not all of it made sense, but I'm almost certain that's how it actually happened. But it almost couldn't have been. My mom opened a wall in their study. There were guns in an end table that was always locked. I don't know. She showed Luke the drawing she'd been working on. She'd been recreating the room she remembered seeing in the study, the one her mother had opened the wall to get into. She couldn't seem to get the symbol on the briefcase right, though. She'd erased and redrawn it so many times, a permanent black smudge lay there. He shook his head.
It doesn't look familiar, but I'm not good with dreams. It does sound important. Have you thought about going back to your old house? See if there's anything left. Maybe there's a clue.
Piper frowned. She actually hadn't thought of that. I mean, it's a 12-year-old trail, but maybe? Luke patted her on the shoulder.
Let me know if you want somebody to come with you.
Piper nodded and thanked him. He stood and entered the training room for his round of Save the Citizen. That night, she approached Pepper. Pepper? The strawberry blonde looked up from her paperwork.
What's wrong, Piper?
Piper sighed. I had a weird dream the other night, and it made me wonder, you don't happen to know what happened to the house I lived with my mom and dad in, do you? Pepper looked down at her tablet and finished typing before she set it down.
When Tony took you in, I convinced him to purchase everything your uncle had owned at the estate sale. Because he's Tony, he went a little overboard. He bought your aunt and uncle's house, and the one where you lived with your mother and father. They're in Tony's name until you're 18. But he never did anything with them. Everything that at your mother and father's house should be where it was when it was abandoned. It never sold until Tony bought it, and no one ever came to clear it out. Your aunt and uncle's things are still in boxes from the estate sale. You know how forgetful Tony can be.
Piper nodded and sniffed slightly before she asked the question burning in her mind. Can I go see it? Pepper nodded.
Absolutely. I can have Happy drive you there tomorrow.
Piper hugged Pepper. Thanks, Pep. I'm going to go see Dad. Pepper nodded and Piper walked away to the medical floor of Avenger's Tower. Pepper sighed and began to make a few calls. Tony grimaced as one of the doctors he had on retainer changed his bandages. When they finished, he laid back in the bed and a soft knock sounded on the door. He called for them to come in, and Piper entered carrying a tray full of food. Hey, Dad, I brought dinner. Tony smiled.
Yay, not hospital food.
Piper set down the tray and stepped aside to talk to the doctor for a moment. When she was done, she sat down next to her father. So, they say you'll be up and around in a few days. Tony nodded, his mouth full of mashed potatoes. Piper looked down at her hands for a moment. Then she spoke. Dad, I'm gonna go to the house where Mom and Dad used to live. Tony paused.
Makes sense you would want to go eventually. Let me know if you need me to go with you.
Piper shook her head. No, I think this is something I need to do myself. Tony nodded. It had taken him time to go through his parents' things after the car accident. Admittedly not 12 years, but still, every person grieved in their own time.
Pepper making all the calls.
Piper nodded. She was still looking at her hands. I was thinking of going tomorrow. Tomorrow was a school day, but Tony knew this was important to her, and really she was too smart for Midtown High anyway.
I'll call you out.
Piper smiled slightly and nodded. Thanks, Dad. She got up to leave.
Pipes.
She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were red and puffy and slightly bloodshot.
No matter what you find, you've still got a family here. Sleep good, kiddo.
Piper nodded and left the medical wing. She didn't sleep that night. She went on patrol and beat up a few muggers, helped a lost kid find her mom, and went back home, but she didn't sleep. After a few hours tossing and turning in her bed, she got up with a sigh and went to her lab. A few hours later, Jarvis piped up.
Miss Parker, Dr. Banner is requesting entrance to your level. Shall I allow him access?
Yeah, Jake, go ahead and let him up. Let him know where I am, too. She didn't stop tinkering with the shield-issued web shooters as the door opened and closed. Bruce sat down in the chair opposite her as she fit the new casing into place on the now smaller web shooter.
Wasn't that shield issued?
He asked as she placed the whole thing back on her wrist and flexed it experimentally. Yes, and I don't care if Fury's mad. Dr. Connors said I could play with them all I wanted. And it was too big. I may go for the around-the-wrist design again. It holds more web fluid. But some of the features on here are too cool to get rid of. She shot a line at the ceiling and climbed up it, testing the tensile strength of the new formula. Bruce followed her with his eyes as she gripped the line with her bare feet and hung upside down above the table before pulling the shooter off and setting it aside. She turned and looked at him, hair hanging down. "What can I do for you, Uncle B?" He sighed.
"Your dad told me what you're going to be up to tomorrow."
Piper sighed, reaching out for a smaller device on the table and tinkering with it. "And?"
"I wanted to see if you were okay. You've been dealing with a lot over the past few months."
Piper nodded and sighed, setting down what appeared to be a gutted version of her old web shooters. "I wouldn't say I'm okay. With Dad hurt, someone very dead set on finding Spider-Girl, and the whole team thing, I haven't had time to breathe, much less deal with any of my shit lately. It's a miracle I can keep up with my schoolwork, let alone spend time with Harry and MJ. I don't know." She sighed and crossed her arms. "I don't know. There are days I wonder if I'm cut out for the hero business." Bruce shook his head at her.
"I think that to myself all the time. The other guy isn't exactly hero material after all, but then I look at everything I managed to do here and around the world thanks to your dad and my place in the Avengers. It's a tough life, there's no denying that, but sometimes you need to take a step back."
Piper nodded. "Yeah, I told Fury I'll be unavailable tomorrow. He seemed like he was hiding something, but then again, when doesn't he?" Bruce laughed lightly. He stood.
"I just wanted to make sure you were okay, kiddo. You should get some sleep, though."
Piper flipped off the web line and hugged him. "I'll try, Uncle B." Bruce wandered off back to his own level. Piper sighed, sitting back down with her projects. She never did get any sleep that night.